In the year 1783, on an island where sugar meant power and blood meant profit, the son of a wealthy plantation owner in Jamaica vanished so completely that his name would later disappear from every surviving British archive, leaving behind only whispers in a colony built on records, inheritance, and control. He was born into privilege at a time when Jamaica was the jewel of the British Caribbean, its plantations generating extraordinary wealth for merchants and politicians connected to the United Kingdom. Ships loaded with sugar departed Kingston's harbour bound for ports such as Liverpool and Bristol, where refinery houses and counting rooms depended on the labour of enslaved Africans thousands of miles away. The boy's father owned hundreds of acres of cane fields and dozens of enslaved men, women, and children whose lives were measured in output and obedience. From birth, the son was expected to inherit not only land, but authority. He grew up inside the great house, surrounded by polished wood furniture shipped from England and portraits of ancestors who had profited from empire. Tutors were brought from Britain to educate him in mathematics, law, and scripture. Letters sent back to relatives in London described him as intelligent and observant, unusually quiet for a child raised in luxury. He was taught that Jamaica's prosperity depended on discipline, that slavery was lawful, necessary, and ordained within the imperial system. Yet from an early age he witnessed scenes that contradicted the civility he read about in books. By 1783, the island was tense. The American War of Independence had just ended, reshaping power across the Atlantic world. Britain had lost its 13 colonies, and attention shifted towards safeguarding Caribbean wealth. Jamaican planters feared rebellion not only from enslaved populations but from shifting imperial priorities. Militia drills became more frequent. Overseers were instructed to tighten discipline. The memory of earlier uprisings lingered in conversations held behind closed doors. The plantation owner's son was 17 that year, old enough to accompany his father through the cane fields and observe the machinery of production. He saw men forced to cut cane under a punishing sun, women carrying bundles heavier than their own bodies, children assigned tasks before adolescence. Unlike many heirs, he asked questions that unsettled his tutors. Why were punishments so severe? Why were families separated by sale? Why did the sermons delivered on Sundays speak of mercy while the weak was ruled by fear? At first his curiosity was dismissed as youthful sensitivity, but servants in the house later recalled that he spent increasing amounts of time near the enslaved quarters, listening to stories told at night in languages not fully erased by captivity. He learned fragments of Akan and Igbo words, enough to greet elders respectfully. Such behavior was dangerous in a society where racial hierarchy defined every interaction. A planter's son was expected to command, not to converse as equal. In early autumn of that year, an incident occurred that colonial records never formally acknowledged. Oral accounts preserved among descendants suggest that the young heir intervened during a violent punishment ordered by an overseer. He allegedly shouted for it to stop, placing himself physically between whip and victim. The overseer later reported the matter to the father, who reacted with fury. Within days, letters were dispatched to associates in Jamaica's colonial administration, warning that the boy had adopted troubling views influenced by radical ideas circulating after the American Revolution. What makes the story extraordinary is what followed. Estate ledgers from 1783 list regular entries for sugar output, slave inventories, and trade payments. The son's name appears repeatedly in marginal notes regarding inheritance planning and educational expenses. Then, abruptly, the references cease. No recorded illness. No burial entry in parish registers. No passenger listing on ships departing Kingston. In a colony obsessed with documentation, silence like that is unnatural. Later British archives connected to Jamaican estates contain correspondence about property transfers and compensation claims, yet his name does not resurface. When historians searched records held in London regarding planter families tied to Jamaica, they found detailed genealogies tracing generations of ownership. The line that should have continued through the son simply narrows and ends. It is as though he had never existed. Speculation has endured for more than 2 centuries. Some believe he was sent quietly to Britain under an assumed identity, removed to prevent scandal if his sympathies toward the enslaved became public. Others argue he may have been killed during a private dispute and buried without formal declaration to protect the family's reputation. There is also a theory whispered in rural communities that he fled the plantation entirely, choosing to disappear among free black settlements in the island's interior rather than inherit a legacy built on bondage. What cannot be ignored is the pattern of erasure. The British Empire preserved shipping manifests, military commissions, land deeds, and inheritance disputes with meticulous care. For a wealthy heir's existence to evaporate from those systems suggests deliberate action. Whether that action was taken by his family, colonial authorities, or by the young man himself remains unknown. The year 1783 marked a turning point in imperial identity. Britain was redefining itself after losing America, reinforcing control over the Caribbean as compensation. Stability in Jamaica was not merely local concern, but imperial necessity. A planter's son publicly questioning slavery at such a moment would have been more than embarrassment. It would have been a threat to unity among elites who depended on shared belief in the righteousness of their wealth. In the decades that followed, abolitionist sentiment would grow within Britain, eventually leading to the end of the slave trade and later emancipation. But in 1783, those movements were not yet dominant. Sympathy for enslaved people among the planter class was rare and often suppressed. If the young heir crossed that invisible boundary, his fate may have been sealed not by open trial, but by quiet removal. Today, researchers examining fragmented Jamaican parish books and British estate correspondence encounter the same void. A birth acknowledged, a youth documented, then nothing. No grave, no exile notice, no inheritance settlement under his name. Only a conspicuous absence in a system that recorded nearly everything tied to profit and lineage. The mystery lingers because it reveals something unsettling about empire and memory. Archives are often treated as neutral guardians of truth, yet they reflect the priorities of those who control them. When a name vanishes from every official ledger, it forces a question that echoes across time. Was the plantation owner's son erased because he threatened the system that raised him? Or did he choose to erase himself to escape becoming its next master? By the closing months of 1783, the atmosphere on the plantation had thickened with suspicion. Though nothing in the official records acknowledged any disturbance, the sugar harvest proceeded as expected, shipments were prepared for export, and correspondence with business partners in the United Kingdom continued with calculated politeness. Letters addressed to firms connected to docks in Liverpool discussed prices and insurance, not family conflict. Yet within the great house, tension hardened into something sharper than disagreement. The plantation owner had built his fortune during decades, when Jamaica stood as Britain's most profitable Caribbean colony. His peers regarded him as disciplined, pragmatic, and loyal to imperial interests. He understood that wealth in Jamaica depended on unity among the planter elite. Any sign of weakness could invite unrest among the enslaved majority or scrutiny from colonial officials stationed in Kingston. Reputation was not merely personal pride, but economic defense. The son's behavior became increasingly difficult to conceal. Servants reported that he had begun documenting conversations with enslaved elders in small notebooks, recording family lineages torn apart by sale and memories of African homelands. He asked about spiritual practices suppressed by overseers, and about the coded songs sung during evening gatherings. He questioned why the law recognized property rights over land and machinery, but denied personhood to those who labored upon it. Such inquiries, if overheard beyond the plantation boundaries, could be interpreted as dangerous sympathies. Rumors reached neighboring estates that the heir had openly criticized the brutality of a recent punishment. In a society structured upon racial hierarchy, for a white planter's son to challenge an overseer publicly destabilized the chain of command. The overseer in question reportedly demanded either the young man's silence or his removal from daily operations. Word of this conflict spread quickly through planter circles, reaching officials connected to Jamaica's Colonial Assembly. Archival fragments from that year show increased communication between plantation owners and administrators in Kingston. While none mention the son by name, several letters warn of youthful indiscretions and ideological contamination influenced by Atlantic events. The phrase likely referred to the ripple effects of revolutionary discourse emerging from the recently concluded American conflict. Planters feared that talk of liberty could cross racial boundaries and ignite rebellion. The father's response appears to have been decisive. Household accounts reveal preparations for travel that never materialized in passenger logs. Trunks were inventoried. Tailors were paid for alterations to formal attire suitable for Britain's climate. There is evidence of a tutor's contract being abruptly terminated, yet no ship manifest departing Kingston that season lists the heir among its passengers. If he left the island, he did so without conventional documentation. More troubling is what happened to his legal standing. Earlier estate drafts included his name as primary inheritor of land, enslaved laborers, and trade contracts. Revised documents created months later omit him entirely, redirecting succession toward a distant cousin residing in England. Such alterations would normally require notarized explanation, particularly in a colony where property disputes could last decades. No surviving record explains the amendment. Oral histories preserved among descendants of enslaved families describe a clandestine meeting held near the plantation's boundary shortly before his disappearance. According to these accounts, the son confessed he could not assume ownership over lives he believed should be free. He allegedly expressed intent to renounce inheritance and expose certain abuses to contacts abroad. Whether such declarations were sincere or exaggerated by time is impossible to confirm, yet they align with the sudden administrative changes that followed. The most unsettling development occurred within parish documentation. Baptismal and burial registers from that district in 1783 remain largely intact, listing settlers, soldiers, and enslaved individuals with methodical precision. If the son had died from illness or accident, his burial would likely appear. It does not. If he had been formally exiled or declared legally incompetent, corresponding notes would be expected in estate papers. They are absent. Silence surrounds his fate. Speculation deepens when considering the political climate. Jamaica's planter class relied heavily on the British government to protect trade routes and suppress uprisings. Any internal dissent among elite families risked projecting instability at a moment when Britain sought to reinforce control after losing its American colonies. Removing a rebellious heir from public record may have been seen as necessary containment rather than cruelty. Another possibility is voluntary disappearance. Free black and maroon communities existed in Jamaica's mountainous interior, semi-autonomous and often in tense negotiation with colonial authorities. Some legends claim a pale young man appeared among such settlements years later, educated and literate, offering assistance with correspondence and trade. These stories lack verifiable names yet persist in local memory. If the heir chose such a path, he would have forfeited not only wealth but identity within British law. Generations later, historians attempting to trace planter genealogies through archives in London encountered the same abrupt gap. The father's lineage continues through alternate heirs, yet marginal notes referencing an eldest son appear scratched out or rewritten in faded ink. In a system obsessed with inheritance and legitimacy, this erasure feels intentional. What makes the mystery resonate is not merely that a young man disappeared, but that every formal trace of his existence as heir to a Jamaican plantation dissolved simultaneously. No scandal was recorded, no public mourning occurred, no explanations circulated in colonial newspapers. It is as though the machinery of empire closed ranks, smoothing over irregularity to preserve the appearance of order. By the time the father died years later, the estate had passed seamlessly into other hands. Sugar exports continued, contracts remained intact, the empire advanced without acknowledging disruption. Yet beneath that smooth continuation lies a fracture, a 17-year-old heir who questioned the moral foundation of his inheritance in 1783, and then vanished from every British archive that once affirmed his future. Whether silenced, exiled, or self-erased, his absence exposes the limits of archival certainty. In a colony where human lives were reduced to entries in ledgers, the deliberate removal of one privileged name reveals how power shapes memory. And as researchers sift through brittle pages searching for confirmation, they confront the same haunting void that began in Jamaica in 1783, a year when an heir stood at the edge of empire and then stepped beyond its written reach. As the months after his disappearance settled into uneasy routine, the plantation adjusted with calculated efficiency. Cane was cut, boiled, crystallized, then packed into barrels stamped for export. Merchants in Kingston prepared invoices bound for firms in the United Kingdom, where investors cared more for tonnage and price than for family scandal. To the outside world, nothing appeared fractured. Yet within private correspondence among Jamaica's planter elite, language grew cautious, almost coded. Several letters exchanged between estate owners in Jamaica reference the need to preserve continuity of authority during a period of domestic irregularity. None mentioned the son directly, yet the timing aligns precisely with the abrupt revision of inheritance documents. Scholars examining copies preserved in collections in London have noted subtle alterations in handwriting and ink tone on key estate papers from late 1783. Margins where his name once appeared show scraping marks, as though a blade had been drawn carefully across parchment to remove it. The father's behavior reportedly changed as well. Witnesses described him as more withdrawn, conducting business through intermediaries and avoiding public assemblies for a season. When he did appear at gatherings in Kingston, he deflected inquiries about his eldest son with curt responses, stating only that arrangements had been made. In a society that prized male heirs as guarantors of stability, such vagueness fueled speculation. Some assumed the boy had been sent abroad for discipline. Others suspected a private confinement within the island, yet no passenger lists departing Kingston that winter contain his name, and no British school registry of the era records a new arrival matching his profile. One theory that gained quiet traction among later historians centers on political anxiety. The year 1783 marked Britain's effort to consolidate its Caribbean dominance after defeat in North America. Jamaica was economically indispensable, and unity among planters was essential. If the heir had openly condemned slavery or threatened to expose abuse to reformist contacts in Britain, his presence could have been interpreted as destabilizing propaganda. At a time when abolitionist sentiment was only beginning to stir faintly in Britain, a planter's son publicly dissenting might have complicated imperial messaging. It is within this context that some scholars examine shipping intelligence from Kingston's harbour records. While no official manifest lists him, there is a curious notation referencing an unnamed gentleman passenger transferred at sea to a vessel bound for a smaller Atlantic port rather than directly to England. The receiving ship's documents are incomplete, leaving a gap that invites conjecture. If he departed under a modified identity, the trail would likely vanish once he stepped onto foreign soil. Another possibility lies within Jamaica's interior. Maroon communities established through treaties decades earlier maintained relative autonomy in mountainous regions. Colonial authorities tolerated their presence in exchange for cooperation against slave revolts. Oral accounts from certain Maroon lineages describe a literate outsider arriving in the mid-1780s, pale-skinned yet renouncing planter privilege. He reportedly assisted with drafting letters to colonial officials and translating agreements. These accounts lack names, yet the timing overlaps suspiciously with the heir's disappearance. If he sought refuge there, he would have crossed not only geographic boundaries but racial and legal ones, abandoning protection under British law. More unsettling is the silence in church archives. Anglican parishes across Jamaica recorded baptisms, marriages and burials with meticulous detail. The plantation owner's family appears frequently in those volumes before 1783. After that year, entries concerning the son cease entirely. No burial, no notation of death abroad, no memorial inscription funded by grieving relatives. For a wealthy family of that stature, absence of ecclesiastical acknowledgement is striking. Financial records deepen the mystery. The estate's debt structure was adjusted in early 1784 to accommodate a revised line of succession. Creditors in Liverpool were informed that previous assumptions regarding inheritance are no longer applicable. Such phrasing implies deliberate correction rather than accidental loss, yet no explanation accompanies it. Investors appeared satisfied, perhaps reassured privately that whatever disruption had occurred would not threaten profitability. Over time, the plantation's output stabilized under new management. The father aged. The distant cousin designated as successor eventually traveled from Britain to assume partial oversight, solidifying the altered lineage. By the time abolitionist movements gained momentum decades later, the memory of the original heir had faded from formal discourse. His absence had become normalized through repetition of revised records. Still, among descendants of the enslaved community, stories endured. They spoke of a young white man who had questioned the lash, and who disappeared after promising change he could not deliver. Some believed he had been silenced by his own family to prevent scandal. Others insisted he escaped willingly, preferring obscurity to mastery. In their telling, his erasure symbolized the limits of conscience within a brutal system. Modern archival researchers face the same wall of silence encountered by earlier historians. Estate ledgers show continuity where rupture should be. British registries trace family lines that abruptly divert. The Empire's paper trail, normally exhaustive in matters of property, offers no definitive trace of a son who once stood poised to inherit acres of cane and hundreds of lives. What remains is a convergence of improbabilities. A wealthy heir vanishes without burial, travel record, or public explanation. Legal documents are quietly amended. Church registers omit ceremony. Financial correspondences adjust language without elaboration. In a society built upon documentation as proof of order, such coordinated absence suggests intention. Whether that intention belonged to a protective father, anxious colonial officials, or the young man himself cannot be proven. Yet the void he left behind reveals something fundamental about imperial history. Archives preserve what power deems useful. They can also obscure what power finds inconvenient. In 1783, a plantation owner's son in Jamaica stepped beyond the boundaries of expectation, and in doing so he crossed into a silence so complete that centuries later researchers still confront the same unanswered question: was he removed to protect empire, or did he remove himself to escape becoming its next master? As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the island continued to generate wealth for Britain, and the machinery of plantation life adapted to new political realities without acknowledging old secrets. Sugar prices rose and fell with European wars, insurance rates fluctuated, and merchant houses in the United Kingdom recalculated risk with every Atlantic storm. In ledgers stored in counting rooms from Liverpool to Bristol, the Jamaican estate, once intended for the missing heir, appeared stable, profitable, untroubled by scandal. Numbers replaced narrative. Profit concealed absence. The father's death decades later might have reopened questions, yet even that moment passed without public reckoning. His will, preserved in partial form in collections tied to London, confirms the revised succession, but contains no reference to disinheritance or loss of an eldest son. It reads as though the alternative heir had always been intended. Such composure in legal language suggests careful preparation. Whether motivated by grief, shame, or political calculation, someone ensured that future generations would encounter a seamless story. Meanwhile, the enslaved population on the estate endured the intensifying debates that would eventually culminate in abolition. News of the end of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and the Emancipation Act decades later filtered slowly through the countryside of Jamaica. Freed people carved out new identities amid economic hardship and racial inequality. Within their communities, the tale of the planter's son did not vanish. It evolved. He became less an individual and more a symbol of possibility, proof that even those born into power could question it. In some versions of the story told in rural districts, he did not die or flee overseas, but integrated quietly into a free-colored settlement under a changed name. In others, he attempted to expose abuses to reformers in Britain and was intercepted before reaching a ship. There is even a strand of oral tradition claiming he left a cache of writings hidden somewhere on the island. Testimonies that, if discovered, would challenge the sanitized memory preserved in imperial archives. No such documents have ever been authenticated, yet the persistence of the rumor underscores how deeply his disappearance unsettled collective memory. Modern historians approaching the case confront methodological limits. They search parish books, shipping lists, probate records, and correspondence networks linked to Jamaican estates. They examine British archival catalogues for missing folios or unexplained numbering gaps. In most cases, they find what appears to be routine bureaucratic continuity. The erasure is not dramatic but administrative. No decree announces deletion. No proclamation condemns dissent. The silence itself performs the removal. This raises a broader question about how empire curated its own memory. The British state documented military commissions, colonial appointments, and property claims with precision. Yet archives reflect the priorities of those who produced them. If a planter's son threatened cohesion among elites or risked drawing attention to brutality at a politically delicate moment, minimizing his footprint may have been viewed as pragmatic. Stability was currency. Reputation was defense. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that his family chose disappearance over confrontation. In a society where inheritance equaled honor, a son who rejected the moral foundation of that inheritance could be seen as destabilizing lineage itself. Rather than prosecute or publicly denounce him, Quiet excision from records may have preserved social standing. Generations later, descendants reading their own genealogies would see no rupture, only continuity. Yet continuity in documents does not erase absence in lived memory. Among communities descended from those enslaved on that land, the story persists as a reminder that the plantation system was not monolithic in conscience. Even if it was unified in practice, the heir's questioning did not dismantle slavery in 1783. It did not prevent suffering or halt production. But it exposed a crack in certainty, a moment when ideology collided with empathy. 2 centuries later, researchers still return to that year, tracing ink that fades at the edges of parchment. They compare signatures before and after 1783. They note where a name once stood and no longer does. They examine correspondence networks that leap abruptly from one heir to another without explanation. Each effort circles back to the same conclusion. The absence was too complete to be accidental. In the end, the plantation owner's son, erased from every British archive, remains suspended between documented history and inherited memory. His disappearance forces confrontation with the nature of archival truth. What survives in official records is not always the full story of a life. Sometimes it is the story power allows to endure. And somewhere in the space between cane fields and counting houses, between Jamaica and Britain, a young man who once stood poised to inherit an empire's wealth stepped beyond its paper trail and into silence that has never been fully explained.